The term consciousness is often used by different people to refer to very different things. So, when we hear that some scientists are working on consciousness, we may expect them to be experts on something we're interested in. But sometimes we just talk past each other and don't have much interest in common. It can be quite disappointing. So, what are the different notions of consciousness that seem so disconnected? In neurology or everyday usage, sometimes by consciousness we mean wakefulness. If people get knocked in the head or have too much to drink, they pass out, and we say they lost consciousness. But in modern basic neuroscience research, consciousness sometimes refers to something slightly different. That is, the having of subjective experiences. Experiences like pain, the subjective quality of the color red, the smell of roses, etc. This question has been considered one of the most important in neuroscience, or maybe even the natural sciences in general, because it is rather difficult to understand how a physical object, like the brain, can generate something that just doesn't seem so physical. To some people, subjective experiences may seem to be beyond the realm of natural science. That's why the question is so challenging. Since the 1990s, this question of what may be the material basis of subjective experience has taken center stage and dominated popular media. These days, you hear philosophers appearing on TV to talk about whether a photon may be conscious. If you think this sounds too far-fetched, no worries. I agree with you, and we won't be talking more about this here. But one consequence of this shift of focus is that a longer history of research in psychology is somewhat sidelined. Of course, psychoanalysts talked about the unconscious mind. There seem to be things going on in our minds for which we seem to have no knowledge or access. As you see, this notion of consciousness is not entirely unrelated to subjective experience or wakefulness. When one is in a coma, presumably one is not aware of one's own mental content. The unconscious mind does not seem to directly give rise to subjective experiences either, at least not that we know. But the psychoanalyst's focus is more about whether one could have any insight to understand what is going on in our own minds, rather than how the qualitative nature of experience may relate to physics, or how to wake patients up from a coma. Because psychoanalysis didn't turn out to be a successful empirical science, it is understandable that some modern neuroscientists would rather want to distance themselves from the topic. We'll revisit what this may mean towards the end of this class. But importantly, the word consciousness is also used in other areas of studies within the social sciences. In the following, we will try to connect these different notions with the help of a theory of subjective experience known as perceptual reality monitoring theory. Marxist theorists famously talked about false consciousness. What was that about? It was not about false subjective experience, as in hallucinations. It was about how certain people fail to comprehend reality correctly. They may misunderstand how resources and power in society are truly allocated. They may see the same physical objects and hear the same sounds as does the ruling class. Perhaps they see the same movement of goods, food, and money. But they got the underlying causes and effects wrong. They underestimate the far-reaching consequences if they were to collectively stop working for the ruling class. That is to say, they fail to reason correctly about what may happen under these counterfactual scenarios. What does it take for a person to get these things right? It seems to come down to having the right story about the world. They need to get the narrative right about what is going on. In stories, things are causal. One thing leads to another. Overall, things have to make sense in a coherent way. In this sense, consciousness is just our rational grasp of reality. Likewise, when the great sociologists Emile Durkheim wrote about collective consciousness, it wasn't so much about wakefulness or subjective experience either. It referred to the common narratives of reality shared between members of a group. It does not mean that different people may merge together into a single conscious entity as if they could share a singular stream of subjective experiences, like in science fiction. Rather, it was about how a group of people may or may not see reality the same way. Getting reality right is no doubt important. It impacts our rational choices and decision-making. Getting it wrong is detrimental to our bargaining behavior. It causes us to be exploited. It can make social cooperation difficult. So perhaps it makes sense to call this important capacity consciousness too. Perhaps this capacity does not pose as deep a metaphysical problem as subjective experience, but how people achieve this rational grasp of reality is not trivial either. The computer scientist Judea Pearl at UCLA has elegantly worked out how this kind of causal reasoning can be done. Turns out, to learn this from mere observation is possible, but it requires a lot of data. So we'd be better off making assumptions, using simplified models. We may want to conceptualize certain events, like smoking cigarettes, as general events instead of representing all the detail, such as what brand is the cigarette, what flavor, do we inhale on every drag, etc. We may represent the events symbolically, as in a graph like this. And then we can also put in some common sense assumptions, such as that lung cancer probably does not cause people to smoke, but rather it should be the other way around. With these, we can test different hypotheses, such as whether there may be a common cause of both smoking and lung cancer, such as industrialization, or something we don't really fully understand. We can't say this kind of causal reasoning is foolproof unless we can do experiments and make controlled interventions, which we often can't do in the real world. But setting these caveats aside, we can form rich and powerful causal models of reality that work more or less okay. The question here is, how does this kind of symbolic level reasoning about causes and effects in a narrative of reality relate to the more raw kind of consciousness, that is, subjective experience? Modern researchers on the neuroscience of consciousness often think that our rational understanding of reality is just a different topic. It has little to do with the truly important issue of subjective experience. It does happen sometimes when a word has two totally different usages. For example, the word palm can refer to a kind of tree or a part of the hand. But is consciousness like that? Are subjective experiences utterly unrelated to our grasp of reality, as if they were just completely unrelated usages of the same word? As I mentioned earlier, some theories of consciousness do treat it totally like a problem in physics. Some scientists try to focus on the qualitative aspects of subjective experience and argue that, by definition, they have no impact on cognition. Some call this phenomenal consciousness. But just because some people define it this way does not mean that we have to accept these definitions. Good definitions should make sense to us. They should be useful for making empirical and theoretical progress. So, are there really subjective experiences that make no impact on our cognition whatsoever? Of course, there are cases when we have a fleeting experience that goes unnoticed, like some mild and brief background noises as we were talking attentively to a friend. But are these genuinely conscious experiences? Let's say they are, even when completely unnoticed. But at least these unnoticed experiences have the potential to impact on our cognition. That is, when we do attend to these experiences, we realize what they are about. We can talk about the content and remember it. But some people think that perception can happen non-consciously. When it happens, perhaps the relevant information impacts our cognition too, without the subjective experience. So these downstream cognition functions may not be unique to consciousness. But the evidence for this is actually not so totally clear. Even if there may be non-conscious perception, can it really impact us to the point that we can talk about the content? Let us grant this to be possible, at least in principle. So non-conscious perception can be quite powerful. there is still something that seems to be unique about conscious perception. When we consciously see something, potentially, that is when we notice and attend to the percept. It gives us the reason to believe that the thing is there. It makes sense for us to believe what we see, at least subjectively, unless we have other reasons to think we are going crazy or maybe hallucinating. Philosophers say that conscious perception has an assertoric force. When we consciously see, the content asserts itself as reflecting reality, here and now. It is quite hard to imagine how a non-conscious percept can have this quality. Non-conscious perception may give us some information, maybe so strong that when we want, we can access it voluntarily. It can tell us something, but when we have a piece of information, typically it can be overridden by other information. The impact of conflicting information can be canceled out by each other. For example, if you have a friend who tells you that it is raining outside and another says the opposite, what you may do is to go outside and see. Let's say you find out that it is not raining. Then you'll just ignore your first friend's remark. She may just be mistaken, and there's nothing to get too hung up about. We can forget it and not let it influence our thinking much further. But compare this to a conscious experience like pain. If you cut your finger, you may be worried that you're bleeding. But even upon determining that you aren't, maybe the cut isn't so deep, or maybe there's actually no cut at all, you still can't ignore the pain. No amount of reasoning or new information can make the pain go away. In fact, amputees sometimes develop what is called phantom pain. That is, pain in limbs that the patients no longer have because the limbs have been surgically removed. These patients are not mistaken about the amputation, but still, it doesn't make the pain go away. It feels as if the pain is there, and telling them that they are wrong just does not help. This stubborn assertoric force of subjective experience seems to have something to do with our appreciation of reality. The theory of perceptual reality monitoring, PRM, can account for this assertoric force in terms of mechanisms in the brain. For example, when you see a cat, you have object-selective neurons firing somewhere in the ventral temporal areas in the brain. But very similar neural activity can be found when you imagine a cat or hold the image of a cat in your mind. What we sometimes say is, you're keeping the information online in your working memory. In fact, these same neurons also show spontaneous activity, as all neurons do. Every now and then, they fire for apparently no obvious reason. But we don't hallucinate cats because of that. This must mean that somewhere in the brain, there's probably a mechanism for telling the difference between these different scenarios: self-generated imagery or working memory, noise, or actual external percept, given some similar visual activity. Let us call this function perceptual reality monitoring. There is some evidence that the prefrontal cortex may play a role in this function. For example, researchers have done single-cell recordings in monkeys. They have found neurons in the prefrontal cortex that reflect the content of what the monkeys see, as well as what the monkeys hold in their working memory. Turns out, however, these are different neurons for seeing and remembering things online, although both groups can be found within the prefrontal cortex. That is to say, we can distinguish between seeing something versus holding the same content in our minds by looking at neurons in this brain area. As one can imagine, if the neural circuits in this brain area are disturbed, we may confuse our own imagination with reality. And in fact, it is thought that these circuits are compromised in schizophrenia. We can think of dreams as another kind of hallucination, too. In dreams, the prefrontal cortex also shows reduced activity when the sensory areas are active. According to the theory, this lack of activity in the prefrontal cortex may be one reason why we subjectively confuse visual activity generated within the brain as reflecting reality here and now. Of course, sometimes when we dream or hallucinate, we're not so confused. These kind of dreams are called lucid dreaming. Or one may be hallucinating after taking recreational drugs voluntarily. In these cases, one may not be really so mistaken about the meaning of the subjective experiences. One may know that one is only hallucinating. However, if one does not end up forming the mistaken beliefs as a rational person, the subjective experiences are themselves somewhat weird and misleading. This is to say, subjective experiences are not the same as what we believe. This is not what the theory says. Like we mentioned earlier, subjective experiences may not always impact on cognition, but they have the potential to do so, to lead to certain beliefs. They have that intrinsic assertoric force. How does that come about? Perhaps we can think about it this way. The visual activity in your brain may say cat. On its own, it could refer to your own imagination, or it could refer to noise. But if your perceptual reality monitor in the prefrontal cortex says, this activity reflects the world right now, this is when conscious perception happens. According to the theory, all this happens automatically, beyond our volitional control. Sometimes we say these are subpersonal processes. It's not like we say this aloud to ourselves, this activity reflects the world right now. It's just an analogy to describe how the brain process works. Together, the two sets of activities, the early visual and the prefrontal, form the basis of something like a logical argument, with the conclusion that there is a cat out there. This accounts for the assertoric force. A rational person should have the tendency to come to that conclusion, given the combination of what the visual and prefrontal areas indicate. This explains why it seems to make so much sense to believe what we consciously perceive. But of course, as in a logical argument, we can resist the conclusion too, if we mix in other premises. For example, one may have the background belief that my perceptual reality monitor is not working right now. Well then, some assertoric force may be retained, but ultimately we can resist jumping to the conclusion that there really is a cat out there. So, background beliefs matter, and this is why, according to PRM, subjective experiences only tend to cause the relevant beliefs. So subjective experiences and beliefs are not identical. Some may complain that PRM over-intellectualizes subjective experiences. It makes experiences seem so complicated and cognitive. Sure, the theory may explain how experiences and beliefs are connected, but that's not why subjective experiences are so intriguing and metaphysically challenging. The real question is how to account for the qualitative character of experience. The color red is more than just a wavelength. It has a subjective, phenomenological quality. There is something it is like for you to see red, and unless you have experienced it yourself, it's hard to describe to you what it is like. Philosophers sometimes say that this is ineffable. It is beyond words. So, what it is like to see red? Is it really so ineffable? It's a bit like seeing orange, a little like brown to me, isn't it? To a lesser extent, it's a bit like purple and pink. It is nothing like seeing silver or black. It's nothing like tasting steamed halibut with ginger, scallion, and soy sauce. It is nothing like the sound of waves in the ocean. Which is to say, the best way to describe the quality of an experience may be in terms of its similarity with other experiences. That's presumably why we use the phrase, what it is like. But to say that seeing red is a bit like seeing pink doesn't do the phenomenology justice. It's more than that. To fully describe what seeing red is like, we need to describe how similar it is with all the other possible conscious experiences. Red looks the way it does because it looks redder than everything else. But that gets tricky. as there are too many possible experiences that are relevant. And this may be why the subjective quality of redness is so difficult to put into words. Even just for color, there are very many shades of red. Philosophers like Austin Clarke and David Rosenthal have suggested that we may get at this with a theoretical construct called a mental quality space. In this space, colors that are subjectively similar are located close to each other. So this is a bit like a standard physical color space, defined by hue, saturation, and brightness. But instead of putting colors that are physically similar close to each other, here it is organized by subjective similarity. So your space may be a bit different from mine. That's why it is subjective. It reflects how things look to you. To avoid circularity, we can define subjective similarity functionally too. That is, it can be in terms of our ability to distinguish two colors when they are placed side by side. Now, once you have this space, we can characterize the quality of an experience in terms of just a single point on the space. If you can pinpoint that the subjective quality of a color experience is defined by a particular position on the space, you're effectively spelling out how similar it is to all possible experiences on that space, in exact terms. In other words, the location on that space determines a profile of pairwise similarities with respect to all possible experiences represented on that space. So it captures all the information about what it is like, without going into a clumsy sentence that would be virtually infinitely long, mentioning and comparing all the relevant experiences. But it's useless to talk about a position on a map unless we know what the map is. Do we have this mental quality space in our heads? I think we do have the mental quality space in our heads, at least implicitly. Remember that earlier I talked about how in perceptual reality monitoring, the prefrontal cortex may need to signal that this activity in the visual cortex reflects the state of the world right now, rather than noise or my own imagination? Obviously, I don't mean that there's a little person living inside the prefrontal cortex, pointing a finger at some visual activity and deciding what it reflects. Instead, I just mean that mechanistically, there has to be an address system for the prefrontal signal to target some specific visual activity and to control its downstream impact. The exact mechanisms are not completely known in detail yet, but for the prefrontal cortex to work in general, it has to be able to send top-down signals for the purposes of attention, cognitive control, response inhibition, etc., and it has to be able to address specific sensory motor activity in the rest of the brain somehow. Some mechanism needs to be there. One can think of this in abstract terms, so that the address may be like page and line numbers in a dictionary. So we can refer to a word by saying that it is on line 12 of page 243. In terms of the brain representations, presumably, the prefrontal cortex can target sensory activities by their neuronal addresses too. Here is the interesting part. When I tell you that two words have similar addresses in a dictionary, you know they may have similar spellings too. That's because of the way the dictionary is organized. So, let's say two words are on the same page. One is just 3 lines above the other. Well then, very likely, one can guess that the first letter, or the first few letters, may be shared between the two words. The two words may even look like each other at a glance. To be able to make this reasonable guess requires you to know that the dictionary is alphabetically organized, obviously. Likewise, in the brain, we know that sensory activities with similar neuronal addresses tend to have the same subjective character, too. In fact, different shades of red involve just slightly different patterns of firing in some of the same neurons. For a very different color, fewer of the same neurons will be involved. For a quite distinct experience, like hearing the sound of thunder, the firing pattern will be found in a completely different set of neurons in another brain region. So, if the perceptual reality monitoring mechanism in the prefrontal cortex knows its way around the organization of the sensory cortices, like the way we know the layout of the dictionary, it can tell how similar a sensory signal is to other signals too. So by indicating that this visual activity caused by these neurons is reflecting the state of the world right now, in an implicit way, it already knows what other sensory signals are similar or dissimilar to the current signal, based on the differences in the neuronal addresses involved. So in this sense, the prefrontal cortex does have a grasp of the mental quality space. And this may be why we know what it is like to have a certain conscious experience. The space is not represented explicitly like a picture in the prefrontal cortex. We don't need that. Instead, what is important is that sensory activities of similar content depend on similar or overlapping neuronal populations. This gives these sensory signals an analog flavor. I'll say more about this in a bit. So, when the perceptual reality monitoring mechanisms refer to these sensory signals, the information determining the subjective quality of an experience is already there in terms of what it is like. That is, how subjectively similar the current experience is compared to all other possible sensory experiences. And that may be all there is when we say that conscious experiences have subjective qualities. So let's try to put the perceptual reality monitoring theory together with the concept of a mental quality space. Let's see what it takes to build a conscious robot, given the theory, first of all, that the robot needs to have perceptual sensors. These sensors need to be able to be driven in a top-down manner, for example, by imagery or attention. As such, there needs to be a perceptual reality monitor to determine whether some activity in the sensors reflects noise, self-generation, or external input. Once this is decided, the perceptual reality monitor will send output to a general reasoning system that is capable of representing beliefs, goals, etc., so as to make rational decisions. Given current technologies, this robot is not so easy to build. But we can, in principle, imagine how this could be done someday. So let's say there are pressure sensors in the arm of the robot. When these sensors send a very strong signal, the perceptual reality monitor may identify them as driven by external stimulation. So together, a strong belief may be formed that my arm is in trouble. However, upon checking the arm, it may realize that the sensory signal is likely a false alarm. There is nothing wrong there. And yet, such a realization doesn't override the signal. The sensory signal, together with the decision made by the perceptual reality monitor, still has an impact on the general reasoning system. Because of the way the perceptual reality monitor works, the sensory signal asserts itself as correctly reflecting the state of the body here and now, even though at a higher cognitive level, the robot realizes something must be wrong. It just can't ignore that strong signal. The robot can also think about what that sensory signal is like. It is subjectively similar to some other signals, such as those sent by pressure sensors right next to the current location in the arm. They are similar in the sense that they are easily confused with one another. Distinguishing between them may not be so reliable. The source of the disturbance is somewhat hard to locate. It is not so similar to another kind of signal driven by the temperature sensors in the same location, though. Both kinds of signals indicate that something is wrong in the arm, but under high physical pressure isn't the same as being burnt by heat. They are easily distinguishable. The robot knows what the current signal is like and what it isn't. In fact, it can easily compare the signal with all other possible sensory signals in terms of how subjectively similar they are. Can we say this robot experiences a dull pain in the arm? According to PRM, the answer is yes. This may sound implausible or even ridiculous, but what do other theories say? Whenever a theory spells out a mechanism for subjective experience, we can always ask whether a simple device or creature with that mechanism would be conscious. This is a challenge faced by all theories. Turns out, Some current theories say that an inactive set of logic gates would, on their own, be conscious. Some say that a network capable of global broadcast would be conscious. Some say that robots can never be conscious, without giving much of an explanation of why not. So in this context, PRM may be the least implausible of the existing theories.
Welcome to Altair 4, gentlemen.
Maybe with some imagination, we can accept that a robot can, in principle, experience dull pains not too different from the way we do. That may be easier to accept than to think that some inactive logic gates, or single photons, can be conscious. So we have a theory that can account for the qualitative aspect of what it is like to have conscious experiences. This is a theory of subjective experience, and yet it does not ignore the cognitive aspects of consciousness. With this, we can now address how subjective experience may be related to the kind of causal narratives we've already talked about. We hinted at this earlier. Inferring the causal relationships between events is hard work. Things are often more complex than they seem. Who caused the decline of democracy in the U.S.? Was it a single person? A political party? Half of the population? Would it have made any difference had there been no foreign intervention? Without being able to go back in time to experimentally manipulate each cause in isolation, there is strictly no way to be totally sure. That's why debating about politics is so hard. As such, for this kind of causal reasoning, we want to make sure noisy inputs are filtered out before they reach the symbolic level. Earlier, I mentioned that sensory signals are analog. What does it mean? In a sense, it may seem trivial. Two signals representing similar content are physically similar to each other. So if you inject just a little bit of noise in a signal, like smudge the neuronal firing by just a tiny bit, the change in your subjective experience should not be so large. This may seem all too obvious, but contrast this with symbolic representations. Think about a sentence. By just changing one letter, you can change the meaning entirely sometimes, like paying my landlord versus playing my landlord. So sentences are not analog in this sense. So the mechanism of subjective experience may be to select the relevant and reliable analog information for further processing on this narrative level, in symbolic terms. We shouldn't let unreliable, non-conscious information influence this process too much. Importantly, we also mustn't confuse our own imagination with reality when we think about how the world really works on this narrative level. So subjective experience may be the interface between perception and higher-level cognition. This may be how the two kinds of consciousness are related. So far, we've talked about simple perceptual experiences, like seeing red or seeing a cat. If we think about emotional experiences, the connection between them and our narratives may become more obvious. Often, our emotions color how we see the world. For example, sometimes we may find ourselves getting angry and have to figure out why. In the moment of an exchange, we may not describe someone as rude, but later on, we may get more upset as we think about it, and we revisit our narrative about what really happened. Which may be why, in politics, how we feel is so important. Some scholars, like Jonathan Haidt, suggest that these subjective affects, moral feelings, may be what is really fundamental. We make up the narratives and arguments as we go, to justify our feelings, to make these feelings seem rational. There may be some truth to that. But we shouldn't think of the narratives as entirely made up post hoc, after the facts. The opposite direction of influence also happens. Sometimes the narratives determine how we feel too. Think again about interacting with a rude person. Our emotional reaction could have been anger, but sometimes it could have been fear as well. Or it might have been guilt. It really depends not just on the immediate sensations in front of us, it depends on how we see the situation as well. So the two kinds of consciousness, subjective experience and narratives of reality, can influence each other in both directions. Perhaps this allows us to say something about culture as well. Earlier, we talked about Durkheim's notion of collective consciousness, that is, how a group of people may share a similar narrative of reality. How do we achieve that? One way is obviously by talking. If you and I disagree on some political issues, we can debate, we can argue. With some luck, we may eventually come to some agreement about what really happened and what is going to happen next in our society. But if you've actually done those debates in real life, you probably realize it's not an easy task. Fortunately, there is another way. That's because subjective experience, and emotional experience in particular, causally interacts with our narrative of reality. So sometimes just by synchronizing our emotional responses to the same events, we can get our narratives in sync as well. For example, when I watch certain politicians talk on TV, I typically get angry or sad. If I see you cheering them on with enthusiasm, as if nothing could delight you more, it may be difficult for us to be friends. People tend to group themselves together this way, according to how similar we are, something we call homophily. And of course, sometimes we don't just go find like-minded people to hang out with. To some extent, sometimes we also turn our friends into people more like ourselves, or the other way around. That is to say, emotions can be contagious. We might have learned that certain animals or insects are scary, not because we have been personally poisoned by them. Part of it may be innate, but part of it may be through observing how people like our parents react too. Sometimes this kind of social transmission of affective responses is called vicarious learning. This may be why culture is more than just a matter of sharing explicit stories. Stories are important, but keeping our simple emotional reactions in sync is important too. And this may in turn help us develop a collective consciousness that is a shared narrative of reality. Which may be why sharing a meal or watching a movie together can help people get along so much better too. Mental disorders are often treated with psychiatric drugs. But sometimes, like problems with your computer, a better fix is to be found at the software rather than hardware level. That is why for some disorders, treatments provided by clinical psychologists are no less effective, and in fact, sometimes much better. You may have heard of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. This is currently one of the most popular kinds of evidence-based psychological treatments. But do you know what the difference is between the C part, cognitive, and B part, behavioral, of CBT treatments? Behavioral therapy has a longer tradition, based on studies of how animals learn simple associations. For example, we can make a rat learn to be afraid of a beep sound if we pair that sound with an electric shock. To get rid of that fear, we can present the same sound over and over again without shock. Slowly, the rat may learn that the sound is no longer associated with danger. Taking this logic to the clinic, we have exposure therapy. If you have phobia for spiders, we can gradually expose you to images of spiders, toy spiders, or maybe eventually real spiders. By doing it in a safe and harmless way, your brain may finally learn that spiders aren't always dangerous. Spiders aren't paired with danger after all. That is to say, we can change your consciousness, both the narrative and the subjective experience, without the need to explicitly talk about things. The psychologist Aaron Beck took these ideas from behavioral therapy and added the cognitive components. So in CBT, we also help patients to talk through their problems. We give them tips as to how to structure their thoughts, how to avoid unhelpful beliefs, and correct certain bad habits in reasoning. Why would this work? It's because our subjective experience and narrative of reality interact, as we explained earlier. So both cognitive and behavioral therapies are important. The cognitive strategies target the higher narrative level. But ultimately, in psychotherapy, we want to change both the narrative and the subjective experience. We don't want people to just think they are not afraid. We want them not to experience excessive fear in certain situations too. But if our narratives and experiences interact, targeting the narratives may ultimately help with both. And likewise, changing behavior and providing the patient with different subjective experiences should help to change the narratives too, at least in principle. Like many scientists, I like the behavioral therapy approach because it seems somewhat more tangible and systematic than verbally instructing people how to think. But that's because I do experiments in the laboratory. We should see that, at least in principle, these are just different ways of targeting the same systems. Why did I suddenly shift to talk about clinical psychology? Remember earlier, I said that psychoanalysis didn't turn out to be an empirically successful science. In fact, depending on how you look at it, it went quite badly. All of that stuff is seen by many as utterly unscientific. With that, many people in psychology and neuroscience have stopped talking about consciousness altogether. They may be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but we all know that guilt by association is common. Likewise, in sociology, some researchers also don't want to talk about Marx anymore because of how Marxist ideas have gone politically in the real world. In the 1990s, there was the so-called revival of the science of consciousness. But what really happened was that discussions in psychology and the social sciences were sidelined, replaced with an undue focus on physics and the hard sciences. There is also the so-called hard problem of understanding how the subjective character of experience can be explained in mechanistic terms, in terms of our place in the physical universe. It is good that we do not neglect the hard problem. It is interesting and conceptually challenging. However, the softer side of things, mental disorders, societal problems, culture, politics, are not unimportant either. In fact, understanding these issues may have more practical implications. We just need to do this properly, guided by empirical science. If a theory of consciousness is good and complete, it should allow us to say something meaningful about both sides of things.